Now, in response to these findings, two new models were proposed. One is known as the late selection model by Deutsch and Deutsch. And the idea here is very similar to Broadbent's early selection filter model, except for the positioning of the filter. So again, we have some information that we are interested in and we want to focus on, we want to attend to, and some information that instead we are not interested in and we want to reject. So both, all these sources of information get transduced in the brain, and so enter our sensory buffer. And then both of these messages get sent off for further processing, for further perceptual processing, and for meaning analysis. The filter acts only after. In other words, in fact, these are the words of Deutsch and Deutsch, every incoming message reaches the same perceptual and discriminatory mechanisms, whether you're paying attention to it or not. And it is this information is then grouped or segregated by these mechanisms according to whether you want to attend to it or not. So all the information gets processed fully. In other words, you do process fully for its meaning, for its contents, all the information that gets transduced. So all the information that gets sensed by your sensory organs. After this stage, information gets filtered. The unattended channel essentially gets prevented from, or rather the information in the unattended channel gets prevented from moving further into your short-term memory, so from becoming available to your conscious awareness and from becoming available for use in further processing and further thinking in creating behavioral responses. On the other hand, the attended stimuli, instead, after they get processed, just like the unattended, those they pass through the filter and are now available to you so that you can use them for some, for some behavior. So again, the important difference here, in fact, there are two differences. One is that just in terms of amount of processing, this model is much more expensive, meaning you're now processing, in a sense, you're wasting a lot of resources. You're processing all the information, whether you keep it or not. And after you've processed everything, you reject what you don't want to keep. However, the flip side of that is that you do get to assign meaning to everything. So in a sense, every information, all the information that comes in, whether you care for it or not, gets processed fully. And after that, the selection mechanism, the filter, keeps some information and rejects other information. Now, the second theory that was proposed in response to those dichotic listening findings was proposed by Anne Treisman and is known as the attenuator theory. Now, this theory suggests that rather than filtering, unattended messages get attenuated. So they don't quite get discarded or rejected. There's just the volume, the gain of this information gets thinned out. Now you can think of this as a two-step process. So you have the two streams of information, the one that you want to attend to and the one you want to reject. And they both make it into the sensory buffer. Now from there, these two channels of information get sent to the attenuator. And the attenuator, it enhances the volume of the information you care for, and it diminishes the volume of the information you don't care for. So you don't lose the information. You just sort of turn down the dial on the volume so that that information is not actually lost. Now, this is the first step, and this step might happen entirely on the basis of simple physical properties of the messages that are coming in, of the information that is coming in, on low-level features, in other words. Then both the attended information and the attenuated unattended information makes it into a dictionary unit. This is similar to the idea of the detector from Broadbent's model. And the idea is that this dictionary unit has in it thresholds for every word in order to recognize it. It's listening to what comes in, and if a certain pattern comes in and it has a certain and it has a certain strength, then you might recognize the presence of a certain word. Now, the message that is attended, its gain has been boosted by the attenuator. And so the words that come in the attended channel, those get recognized because sort of they were said very loudly, in other words, right? The volume of these words is very strong, and so you can recognize them. The unattended message, on the other hand, got attenuated, and so comes in at a lower volume. However, inside this dictionary unit, there's a hierarchy of processes, a hierarchy of detectors. And some things might happen to have high priority. For example, there are some things that are stored in your dictionary unit because of your experience, because of things you've learned, that are stored in here as high priority words. For example, if your name comes in, even if it got attenuated, your name has a very low threshold for being recognized. So in other words, even if you're not listening to a conversation, right, let's say the stream of information from a conversation happening behind me gets attenuated, my name is said, it passes through the attenuator, it now sort of has a lower volume, but inside the dictionary unit, my name is a high priority word. So it has a very low threshold for being recognized. And so even though it got attenuated, I will still recognize that somebody said my name, and so I'll turn around and I'll get interested in what is being said behind me. Now, you don't, it's not just high priority words that might have a low threshold. There might also be mechanisms that allow for things to be contextually particularly appropriate to also have temporarily a lower threshold. For example, somebody is talking about a certain topic, maybe words that are related to that topic might be might have temporarily a lower threshold, meaning they are expected. And so the dictionary unit sort of lowers the threshold of things that are expected. So this is a mechanism that will allow for information that is not being monitored, so unattended information, to still make it through and to be under certain circumstances. If somebody mentions my name, if somebody says the word fire, right? Words that have high priority, it still allows me to recognize them. However, there is one important feature to this model. According to this model, even though information still makes it in through the unattended channel, there's only one channel for analyzing meaning. What this means is that you can't listen to two things at the same time. If somebody says my name here, what's going to happen is not that I can hear both that conversation and the one that I'm engaged in. I will stop being engaged in the first conversation, and my attention will now go towards monitoring the other conversation. In other words, I can't process at the same time two stimuli. One is the attended and one is the unattended that has high priority. If something comes in the unattended channel with high priority, I will switch to that one. And see, this explains findings such as the Dear Aunt Jane finding, where I hear dear in the channel that I'm monitoring, then aunt comes in the other channel. It's predicted, it's appropriate given the word dear, and so I now listen to that. It's not that I'm listening to both. I'm listening to the first channel and then I'm switching to the new channel. So according to the Treisman model, there's only one channel for analyzing meaning. You can't analyze at the same time the attended and the unattended information. You analyze the attended, then something important comes in the other side, you switch. And then unless you switch back, right, you're now ignoring what should have been the attended channel. And the reason I'm stressing this fact is because this specific prediction will be very important for evaluating this theory. Now, in 1973, Don Mackay, who used to be in the psychology department at UCLA, did a very clever twist on the standard dichotic listening task. he was interested in what people remembered from sentences that they heard through an attended channel. But he added a little twist to this experiment. So the setup was the same, was the conventional setup. There's an attended channel, there's an ignored channel, an unattended channel. And to prove that you're attending, as the participant, you are shadowing in real time what's coming in through the channel that you have to attend to. Now, the twist was that in the attended channel, sometimes there would be sentences that would have homophones, meaning there'd be sentences that would have lexical ambiguities to them. One sentence, for example, was, "The boys threw rocks at the bank yesterday." And you realize that this sentence has two perfectly legitimate interpretations. One is that there were some children yesterday that went out to a nearby river and were throwing stones towards the riverbank. The alternative interpretation, which is, given the context, perfectly fine, perfectly allowable, is that there's a group of children who are very upset at some financial institution and were throwing stones at it. Now, here's what Don did. In the unattended channel, so in the channel that you had to ignore, he either played a word that would prime the meaning financial institution, or a word that would prime the meaning riverbank. And what he was interested in is if later he gave the two options to the participant and said, which of these two sentences, context did you hear? If the participants heard money, money, money in the unattended channel, they would be more likely to interpret this ambiguous sentence as referring to something happening at a financial institution. If instead they heard the word river, 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 then they might be more likely to interpret this sentence as referring to children being nearby a river bank. And the findings were that indeed the words played in the unattended channel did prime the interpretation, did bias the interpretation of the homophones. Exactly as he expected, if you play the word money in the unattended ear, participants would be more likely to say that the scene, what was happening, was that somebody was throwing stones at a financial institution. Now, interestingly, it's not that these words were heard by the participants, because when participants were asked which words did they hear in the unattended channel, none of them reported hearing the words money or river. So it's not that these words were consciously perceived. They were not consciously perceived, but they still acted to bias the interpretation. And see, this is crucial because this implies that the unattended meaning can also be analyzed without awareness. So this is contrary to Anne Treisman's prediction that there's only one channel for analyzing meaning, and it's the conscious channel, right? So in Anne Treisman's, if this fell the way of the attenuator theory, for this to happen, participants should have become aware of the word money being said. They would have switched, started hearing money, and then switched back. But participants didn't report hearing anything. So there must have been a mechanism for the words to have been interpreted without awareness and to affect the interpretation of the attended channel. And this, of course, is compatible instead with the late selection model, because under that model, the unattended words get fully processed. So they have the power to unconsciously prime what is happening. You never get to know that those words were spoken because the message in the end is rejected. It never gets to your conscious awareness, exactly as Don Mackay found. But it does allow for these type of interactions, these type of priming. So this experiment definitely sides with the late selection model by Deutsch and Deutsch and is evidence against the attenuator model. Nonetheless, it's not that simple because within this publication, there were several experiments. One experiment was a syntactic ambiguity variant of the same experiment that you just saw. except instead of having the ambiguity at the level of the interpretation of a word, the ambiguity was at the level of interpretation of the syntax of a sentence. For example, take this sentence. They knew that flying planes could be dangerous. Now, you realize that there are two ways of interpreting this sentence. Either flying planes are planes that fly, or that people that fly planes, right? Sorry, that the act of flying a plane could be dangerous. So here too, there are two possible interpretations. And again, the question is the same. Can you prime one interpretation versus another by playing a message in the unattended channel? So in the unattended channel, for example, he would play things such as growling lions. So trying to prime the interpretation of flying planes as in planes that fly. However, in this case, what was played in the unattended ear didn't seem to ever bias the interpretation of the syntax. In fact, they tried this in several ways. They could never get a message in the unattended ear to prime the interpretation of a syntactic structure heard in the attended ear. So while on the one hand, the first part of this experiment is in favor of the late selection model, this second finding does imply that not all information, not all meaning is fully analyzed before being filtered. Some amount of meaning, maybe the lexical, gets analyzed, but some other part of the meaning, the syntactic, probably does not get analyzed, because you cannot use the same strategy to prime the interpretation of the attended message. And this is inconsistent with the late selection model.